before, and to make our next day's bread. One of the things that I think is really relevant in this is that it is totally impossible to remove all the yeast from our dwellings 100%. It's in the air. It's everywhere. And that's why if you take a bowl of flour, a jar with some flour and water in it, and just sit it out for a few days, it'll start bubbling. And I've done that many times in making bread. I remember when we opened up our bakery, went and got a mixer at that was for sale on eBay, and when we got back with it, one of the things I did was to test it out with some stiff dough. I took just flour and water and mixed it together and in the bowl and mixed it to see if the mixer was going to hold up. And when we got back from our trip going to pick it up, it was getting late, so I was a little tired, so I just covered the bowl up and left it, and I said, well, I'll go back in the morning and I'll clean this out. And I wanted to cover it so it didn't get dried in there very badly. And when I went back the next morning, the whole bowl was full of this dough starter, just from being overnight in this this old bakery. And yes, pâte fermenté is the French term that's used for the old dough. So using these definitions, how are we to understand the prohibitions concerning Seor and Chametz? Do we prohibit any products with the 5 grains during the Feast of Unleaveneds? And what about rice and beans? You know, in Orthodox Jewish homes, they will not have any of these products in their homes during this time. And macaroni, pasta, crackers, anything that's made from any of those 5 grains, and some Orthodox even use rice and beans and prohibit them in their homes during this time. What about vinegars, wines, and beers? Do we prohibit the use of these products during the Feast of Unleavened? And what about eggs, especially egg whites? Because in our baking, we use egg whites to leaven products sometimes. We'll beat the egg whites into a foam and then fold it into the baked product to make it foam up, or to make it puff up. Baking powder, baking soda. Do we prohibit these because they are chemical leaveners? As we have seen from the definition of the words, I do not presently see them prohibiting the use of these grain products as long as we do not allow them to ferment. And I think where the prohibition came in is because the rabbis wanted to create a safety net so that the chametz would not be found in their borders. They have devised a plan or a system whereby the bread, when they make the unleavened bread, the matzah, from the Hebrew word for unleavened bread, whenever they make it, it has to be from the time that the water touches the flour to the time that the bread is baked. It has to be under 18 minutes. It cannot be over 17 minutes and 59 seconds, I believe it is. Because if it is 18 minutes or more, it has to be thrown away. And especially working in a bakery, this would seem reasonable. But I think that it's not the grains which we are prohibited, only the fermentation of those grains. I think the exception would be the use of those grains from the New Year's harvest before the offering of the first fruits. because the scriptures tell us we're not to eat of the new harvest until the first fruits have been given, and the first fruits are given of the barley at the time of the Feast of Unleaveneds. So we would not eat the new grain and the new crop, but we would finish up the old grains that were left over until after first fruits. Malt vinegars and beer should definitely be removed from our homes, I believe, because they are produced from a process which uses and or produces seor. Beer comes from barley, malted grains. Malt vinegar comes from malted grains, usually barley, sometimes wheat, and there is some beers made with wheat that are being made now, and so I think those things would be prohibited from our homes during the Feast of Unleaveneds. For those that don't understand why, the process of malting is you take the grain and you soak it until it gets puffed up and swelled with water. It soaks the water in, and then it sprouts a little root, and then once the root comes out, then it will sprout on the other end a little bit of green. You want to get the grain before it sprouts the green leaf, but you want to get it when it has a fairly nice little root start on it, and then you take that and dry it or parch it in an oven, and then you grind it into a flour consistency. This brings out the sweetness of the grain, and that's one of the reasons why they use malt in a lot of the French bread recipes that I used and studied and looked at. They had malt powder. You don't want to use a whole lot because it makes your bread gummy, but still, it is a fermented grain. There's some fermentation that actually goes on in that process of making the malt. Apple cider vinegar and distilled vinegars are not produced in this way. They use no malt in the production of apple cider vinegar. I can remember a town in Evansville, Indiana. They had Indian Summer apple cider vinegar factory, and when you drove past that place, you could just smell the vinegar in the air. You get about a half a block away, and it was just very powerful smell of the apple cider vinegar being produced. And what they use there is called a mother. They'll take and they'll warm the apple juice, the apple cider that they've allowed to ferment up to a certain temperature and keep it there, and then they'll skim off the foam on the top, and eventually this will make what they call a mother. And you can take that piece of mother and put it in a new batch of apple cider and make your new apple cider vinegar. Even though it uses a process that does ferment, it's not the same as the seor that is prohibited. And then distilled vinegar, usually made from corn, sometimes a few other vegetables like potatoes, I think, can make distilled vinegar. It makes vodka, I know that. But they will take and distill this sugars out of the grain or the potato and make a vinegar out of it. Okay, what about wine? Is the yeast used to produce wine equivalent to seor, thus making wine chametz? Orthodox Judaism says no. And I tend to agree on the one hand, because we cannot use wine to ferment dough.